Today we will be learning about absolutism. At the end of today's lesson, you should be able to explain the beliefs of absolutism and divine right and analyze what was positive and negative about having an absolute ruler. This lesson marks the beginning of our unit on revolutions, so we'll be talking about how things were changing in different parts of Europe and Asia at this time. Before we get started, I want you to think about this quote by James I. Based on this quote, why do you think people would be more likely to follow the king's orders? So James I said, "The king is from God and law is from the king." If you need to think about this, you may pause the video and collect your thoughts and then write down your answer on your guided note. So absolutism in Europe. Absolute monarchs are kings or queens who believe that all power within their state's boundaries rests in their hands. Their goal was to control every aspect of society, and they believed in what is called divine right. Divine right is the idea that God created the monarchy and that the monarch acted as God's representative on earth. So again, if you need to pause the video to answer this question, please do that. But think about this. How a monarch or a king or queen would act knowing that he or she received his or her power from God. So how might they act knowing they received their power from God? So how do monarchs gain, maintain, and keep their power? Monarchs are few, and the people that they govern are many. So they had to make sure that they're using certain tactics in order to maintain their power. So one way they do this is religion. Another way they do this is by expand their territories. 3, they do this by using the military. And 4, strong governments and legal structures help them to keep their power. In France, the most powerful ruler in French history, Louis XIV, said, "I am the state." This is the best example of an absolute ruler. He is saying that he himself is France. Like, all things France are him. This kind of reminds me of a lyric by Jay-Z where he says that he's not a businessman, he's a businessman. Where he's saying, like, I am the business, I'm not a part of the business. So same thing with Louis XIV. He's saying, I'm not a part of France, I am France. He became king at the age of 5 with a protector because, of course, who wants a 5-year-old running an entire country? You don't know much about life yet at 5. So the protector and his guardians kind of make decisions for France until he's old enough to do that. But Louis gains power at the age of 23, and he referred to himself as the Sun King because he thought that everything revolved around him. He had absolute power over nationwide policy making, and he weakened the power of nobles by excluding them from his councils and making them move to Versailles, which was a palace that he built to be kept in check. So he wanted them all in one place so he could keep an eye on them, and he lessened their power even though that they were wealthy families with lots of money and influence, so that they didn't have as much influence. He died at the age of 76, and when he died, France was in debt and surrounded by many enemies. So these are a few pictures of the Palace of Versailles. It's a very beautiful, ornate, huge building. Ornate just means that it's very, very decorative and very detailed decorations. So think about this. How can a ruler live so comfortably in a palace when many of his or her people are starving and poor? Because that was the case with Louis XIV. He was living in all this fancy things in the Palace of Versailles, and the people of France were poor at this time. Another absolute ruler is Ivan IV of Russia. He became the first ruler to take the title of Tsar, which means Caesar in Russian. He expanded boundaries eastward, and he was known as Ivan the Terrible. He killed many noblemen and their families, and he stabbed and killed his own son. So if you remember back to when we talked about the gunpowder empires, that was a very common practice for kings to stab their sons or kill their sons as a way to eliminate competition. This is the same idea here. He created the first national police unit, and he was known for his ruthless deeds, hence the name Ivan the Terrible. Peter the Great followed Ivan the Terrible in Russia. He saw westernization as a way to make Russia stronger. So Russia is in Eastern Europe and Asia, and Peter the Great was looking at Western European nations like Great Britain and Spain and Portugal as an example for Russia. So he increased the military, hired European military officers. He was a lifelong learner, and he wore Western European clothes. He created St. Petersburg as a new port and made it the new capital, referring to it as a warm water port. So think about this. And again, if you need to pause to answer and think about the question on your guided notes, please do that. What it would be like for your king to say your culture is backwards and needs to change to be like someone else. So in England, during absolutism, there were two families that believed heavily in divine right. Those families were the Tudors and the Stuarts. And they did what they wanted, not caring about what Parliament had to say. So Parliament is a governing body in England, very similar to our Congress. Like the Parliament makes laws for England. And the Tudors and Stuarts were like, whatever, we don't answer to your laws. We answer to God, and we are God's earthly creatures that are meant to do his right. England went back and forth between Catholic and Anglican churches, and there were many deaths on both sides. So the leaders from these two families and the leaders of England going back and forth between if England was Catholic or Protestant. So Henry VIII was Catholic, but he went to Protestantism. Edward VI was Protestant. Mary I was Catholic. Elizabeth I was Protestant. James I was Protestant. Charles I was Protestant, but he married to a Catholic. And then Charles II was Protestant, but converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. So James I is also known as James VI of Scotland. He became king after Queen Elizabeth died without an heir. So there was no one to take the throne. And English people didn't trust him because he was Scottish. So because there was no one to take the throne, they took like their closest relative that was a male and made him king, which was James VI of Scotland. He refused to work with Parliament and disbanded it when they refused to raise taxes. He wrote something called the True Laws of a Free Monarchy. He had absolute authority because he believed God chose him to rule. And he said this quote, kind of solidifying his absolute power. What God hath conjured, let no man separate. I am the husband, and the whole isle is my lawful wife. So think about this. How would you consider divine right if you and your king or queen have a different faith? So if you were Anglican and your king or queen was Catholic, would you still believe in divine right? Or if your king or queen was Catholic and you were Anglican, would you still believe that they were sent by God to rule on earth?